Videos like this are made possible by my lovely supporters over on Patreon. A big thank you to all of them, and for this video in particular, Michael Spatz. If you want to have a hand in deciding what we cover next on the channel, you can do so for as little as $1 when you head over to patreon.com/Tukey24. That is patreon.com/Tukey24. As a fan of the Boston Bruins, please don't leave. As a fan of the Boston Bruins, when it comes to the Stanley Cup playoffs, I've felt the full range of emotions. The highest of highs, watching Zdeno Chara raise the Stanley Cup in 2011. Contrast to the scenes of looting and whatever was happening here was the serene setting of my parents' living room on the other side of North America as I stood hugging my dad with tears in our eyes. The duality of sports, it's beautiful, yet cruel, as emphasized by the lowest of lows, watching both Chicago and St. Louis raise the cup at TD Garden within a 6-year span. Brad Marchand may not have been the only one to shed some tears that night either. Every season, realistic or not, the goal for every NHL team is the same: win the Stanley Cup. With the 2021-2022 regular season in the rearview mirror, hockey fans all over the world aren't just looking forward, but we're looking back at the season that was. For the first time, 32 teams began an NHL season with the hopes of accomplishing something great. Unless we're talking about a team like the Arizona Coyotes, who are in the midst of an historic tanking effort, but I guess you could say that said effort's great in its own way. For 20 of the 32 NHL clubs, they've accomplished that goal at least once in their histories, even if for some teams those photos are in black and white. For 7 others, they've at least made it to the finals, only to fall short. So what of the other 5? Well, that's the topic of today's video. We're going to take a look at these 5 teams. We'll take a look at their deepest playoff run and explore reasons as to why they never made it to the final 2, whether it be extremely tough competition, mismanagement, or in the case of one team, simply a lack of time. We'll start off with the most obvious. The NHL's newest franchise, number 32, the Seattle Kraken. The 2021-22 season represented their inaugural campaign, and fair or not, expectations were high. Just a few short years before, number 31, the Vegas Golden Knights, shocked the sports world, taking a team of undesirables and making it all the way to the Stanley Cup final in their very first season. Would Seattle be able to do the same? No, they would not. After making some very questionable choices in their expansion draft, they still entered the season with an interesting roster on paper. Philip Grubauer was brought in as a free agent, the last line of defense, behind the blue line featuring the likes of veteran and new captain Mark Giordano, Jamie Alexiak, Vince Dunn, and Adam Larson. Certainly not a bad foundation. Then you have the offense, while not featuring the likes of Vladimir Tarasenko and Max Domi, among others, like it probably should have, still featured strong players such as Yanni Gourde, Jared McCann, and Jordan Eberle. Maybe, just maybe, they could replicate what we had seen from the likes of William Karlsson and Jonathan Marchessault in Vegas. However, to wrap this team up in a pretty little bow, they brought in Dave Hakstol as their head coach. Who spent less than 4 years in Philadelphia, making the playoffs twice, but losing in the first round both times. Now, I'm not saying it's all his fault, but the team collapsed. What should have been a difficult defense to break down was top 10 in terms of goals allowed, while the offense was perhaps worse than even the most staunch pessimist could have predicted, being bottom 5 in goals scored. It quickly became clear there would be no repeat. Ron Francis and company would be taking the slow and steady approach. At the very least, it may perhaps spare the new fan base from drawing the ire of the rest of the league, as we've witnessed with the previously aforementioned Vegas Golden Knights, but it will most likely be a while before we see the Kraken in a playoff spot, let alone reaching for the crown. Another team that took the slow and steady approach with their expansion draft, although not by choice, the Columbus Blue Jackets. The NHL rapidly expanded between 1991 and 2000, going from 22 teams up to 30. And while the expansion fees were significantly lower, for example, the San Jose Sharks ownership group paid $45 million to join the league, which would be roughly $90 million today, whereas the ownership group of the Seattle Kraken just paid $650 million, which would have equated to $326 million in the early 90s. Obviously, there's a lot of factors in the pricing of those expansion fees, but a big part of it, the way the expansion draft was handled. Nobody expected the Vegas Golden Knights to make it to the Stanley Cup Final in their first year, but they did have a far greater chance than the expansion teams of the past, such as the Blue Jackets or even the Sharks, and they paid a big price for that. Back in 1991, and trust me, this will be a video of its own someday, the San Jose Sharks joined the league after an ownership dispute. The Gund family, owners of the Minnesota North Stars, wanted to relocate the team to the San Francisco Bay Area. The NHL declined, but a compromise was reached. The Guns would sell the North Stars to keep the team in Minnesota, and they would introduce the Sharks. The Guns also worked out a clause with the expansion draft where they'd get to choose 24 players from within the North Stars organization to draft. Then, both the Sharks and North Stars would take part in an expansion draft, selecting 10 players each from the same pool of talent from other NHL teams. Needless to say, the Sharks would only win 28 of their first 164 games. Now, why do I tell this story? Well, you'd think a year later that you'd maybe want to give new expansion franchises in Ottawa and Tampa a bit of a fighting chance. And you'd be wrong. Again, the franchises had a dire list of players to choose from while competing with one another, leading the Sens to win just 51 of their first 298 games, while the Lightning would only fare marginally better. This expansion practice would continue in 1993 with the addition of the Florida Panthers and Mighty Ducks of Anaheim, but hey, the Panthers would be in the Cup final by 96, and the Ducks would make the playoffs in 97, so clearly it's just been bad management for other teams. So in 1998 and 99, respectively, the Nashville Predators and Atlanta Thrashers would join the league, and hey, they wouldn't have to compete directly with one another for talent. So finally, a team might be something else other than god-awful when joining the league.
Oh, wait, you serious?
Yeah, as it turns out, the rules were still very much in the current club's favors. Nashville walked away with a middling roster and missed the playoffs for the first 5 years of their history, while the Thrashers, under essentially the same rules, fared even worse. Which brings us to 2000, where certainly, by this point, the NHL had learned its lesson and learned that you needed to give teams a better chance. Yeah, no, they had another dual entry into the league, with both Columbus and Minnesota selecting from the same pool of players.
Let me laugh even harder.
So needless to say, it was a very rough start. For the Jackets, they would win less than 30 games in each of their first 4 seasons and wouldn't make their first playoff appearance until 2009, where they were swept by the Detroit Red Wings. After another 4 years of missing out, they'd make the playoffs again and lose to Pittsburgh, but in 6 games this time. 2 more years of missing the playoffs leads us to 2017, where they would lose to Pittsburgh in 5 games. But they'd make it back to the playoffs in back-to-back seasons for the first time. They'd play Washington in the first round the next year, and they'd lose in 6 games. Now, obviously, we can't blame and aren't blaming the horrific expansion draft as the sole reason for their struggles. Mismanagement, tough competition, and the other factors I mentioned are certainly relevant here when talking about the history of the Columbus Blue Jackets, but it did all lead to the best moment in team history in 2019. The Blue Jackets made the playoffs again, and they'd get to take on the powerhouse Stanley Cup favorite Tampa Bay Lightning, and they were screwed. They were down 3-0 in Game 1. Lightning in 3 don't even play the 4th game. This series is done. The Blue Jackets would win Game 1 by the score of 4-3. They'd win Game 2 by the score of 5-1. They'd win Game 3 by the score of 3-1. And they would win Game 4 7-3. Finally, after years of struggling, some success, one of the biggest playoff upsets of all time for their first ever playoff series win, and they'd go on to round 2 for the very first time, where they would lose to the Bruins in 6, baby. And to date, that is the furthest that the Jackets have gone. It's not a title that they'd want, but for my money, no fan base has suffered quite like those in Columbus. Just 41 playoff games in their history to date, 1 trip beyond the first round. but at least they have Nasher. Team number 3, the Minnesota Wild. Now, as we discussed, the Wild joined the league alongside Columbus. However, it didn't take them long to make an impact in the postseason. Their first trip to the playoffs, still the furthest they've gone to date, but what a trip it was. Because in 2003, the Wild shocked the hockey world. In round 1, after winning game 1 on the road, they dropped 3 straight games to Patrick Waugh and the Colorado Avalanche. Again, done deal. Series over. Until the Wild won game 5 by the score of 3-2. Oh, all of a sudden we're going to game 6, where the Wild win again 3-2, this time in overtime. And then game 7, where the Wild would win 3-2 in overtime. Andrew Brunette scoring the goal that would push the Wild into the second round, and in the process, retiring Patrick Waugh. In the second round, they'd square off with Marcus Naslund in the Vancouver Canucks. The Wild would find themselves in a very familiar situation, down 3-1 in the series after the first 4 games. But they'd win game 5, 7-2, on the road at GM Place. They'd win game 6, 5-1, and somehow they'd do it again, winning game 7 by the score of 4-2, and the miracle run continued. However, it wouldn't last. In the conference final, their miracle run would be overshadowed by another miracle run, this one from Jean-Sebastien Giguère and the previously mentioned Mighty Ducks of Anaheim, who would sweep the Wild and go on to play for the Stanley Cup. The Wild would make the playoffs 10 times in the next 17 seasons, but would only make it to the second round twice, losing in consecutive attempts to Chicago in 2014 and 2015. 2022 represents perhaps the Wild's best chance yet to relive the magic of 2003. They entered the playoffs with the best regular season record in franchise history, and without a doubt the most talented player in team history, Kirill Kaprizov, after posting his first 100-point season. There could be another magic run in store for the state of hockey. The Winnipeg Jets. The real Winnipeg Jets. Yeah, that's better. Jokes aside, in 1996, the Winnipeg Jets moved to Arizona, and everyone was happy, and there were no problems at all, and people on the internet have never complained since. Okay, so I lied about the jokes aside. Flat out, the newly rebranded Coyotes had a playoff caliber team right out of the gates. In fact, they made the playoffs in 5 of their first 6 seasons in the desert, but they never made it out of the first round. They'd missed the playoffs for 6 straight seasons before making it back in 2010 and 2011, where they lost in the first round, both times in fact, to Detroit. But it was after this that we had another magical run in store. In 2012, after winning 42 games in the regular season and claiming the Pacific Division crown, yes, 42 wins were enough to do that, they'd take on Chicago in round 1 and win in 6 games, moving on to the second round for the very first time. In said second round, they would play Shea Weber and the Nashville Predators, and they'd beat them in 5 games. So not only did they make it to the second round, but they won convincingly. This would set up a showdown against the 8th-seeded LA Kings, who again were on a miracle run of their own, and much like we saw with Minnesota, that lower seed would prevail. The 8th-seeded Kings would win the series in 5 games. They would go on to win the Stanley Cup over the New Jersey Devils. The Yotes have only made the playoffs 1 time since then, losing in the first round once more. But as mentioned at the start of the video, they're currently in the process of one of the more impressive scorched earth rebuilds in NHL history. So while it might be a long time before they're likely to make the playoffs again, they could just be putting the pieces in place to finally make it to the final. And last but not least, to cap off this video, we'll actually talk about the Jets this time. The Jets returned to the NHL in 2011, relocating from Atlanta. We already mentioned how bad off the Thrashers were, with just 1 playoff appearance in 12 years, where they were swept by the New York Rangers in the first round, despite being the Southeast Division champions. Needless to say, the Jets didn't inherit a great team. Fans would have to wait until their 4th season to see a playoff berth, where they'd be swept by the Anaheim Ducks in 2015. 2 more years of playoff-less hockey would follow, but in 2018, they'd finally put it all together. After a 52-win season, the Jets would take on Minnesota in round 1, with the Jets winning in 5 games. Nashville, a constant in the second round, would be awaiting, where the Jets would survive a 7-game series and would move on to the conference final where they would play the Vegas Golden Knights in their inaugural season. Vegas would win in 5. Heartbreak for Winnipeg. Overshadowed as the feel-good story, the underdog story really, by the new kids on the block. The Jets would make the playoffs in each of the next 3 seasons, only making it to the second round once, where they'd be swept by Montreal in 2021. And this year, shockingly, they failed to live up to expectations and missed out on the playoffs entirely for 2022. So where do they go from here? Seems like a toss-up. It's a club in limbo, torn between keeping the core together and giving it another go, or tearing it all down and starting over after missing their window. If there's any solace, they're in the exact same spot the Calgary Flames were in, and all of a sudden, they just won a division title. So with that, I will thank you very, very much for checking out this video. If you haven't, make sure to check out my second channel, TWOGIE24, for more video game-based content, such as my franchise modes. Also, make sure to check out the Tukey's Take podcast, which you can watch right here on YouTube or listen to wherever podcasts can be heard. We'll see you all next time.